Hey, it is Zennial Gamer, and we are here today to talk about the surprise balance patch that Come To Us dropped on us. Okay, so the first of the Phoenixes, Phoenix, something, whatever they are, whatever the plural of a Phoenix is, because the word sounds kind of plural to me already, but anyway, I digress. But the actual buff here is that previously you had to strip a beneficial effect in order to add defense break. You no longer have to strip that beneficial effect. And then they decrease the damage by 15%. So the big thing I don't know is if it hits you before or after a defense breaks you. Because if it hits you before a defense breaks you, then it seems kind of unnecessary that they did the damage decrease. And if it hits you after a defense breaks you, then this is kind of an interesting buff. The fact that you no longer need the qualifier, because most of the time I face an Eludia, my monsters are in will. And I know Eludia hits really hard, but it sounds like they might be taking away one of the counters to Eludia. Now, of course, the main counter is its 94 base speed, so generally speaking, you just have to try and outspeed it either way. Now, for the Dark Phoenix, they basically just added a defense break, so they reduced the 3-turn brand to 2, which is no big deal there, and then added a defense break, so you now have a Nat LD5 Leia. I don't really know the multipliers on Dark Phoenix. I don't know if this is quite enough of a buff or not, but it's certainly a move in the right direction. And then for Teshar, what they've done is really interesting. They took the Skill 3 Tempest, they turned it into a passive. Now the way this reads, I think it's a passive that still has a cooldown. So it's going to work exactly like the Skill 3 did before, except every time you attack the enemy, the Skill 3 is going to activate. And along with it becoming a passive, they did decrease the damage by 24%, so it's going to be nearly impossible to get him to clear waves in a B12. But while I don't think that Teshar is necessarily going to shine by himself, I do think there are some really fascinating team-up comps that could be amazing with him. So, for example, just dropped the triple Ikaru video this morning, right? The how to build this team. Imagine something like this in Giants. Now, here's the key, though. If that Tempest is on a cooldown, we have to get some sort of reliable AoE defense break, and right now there is no smart AoE defense breaker, like no smart AI AoE defense breaker. So I think the change to Teshar is really intriguing. It's going to be fun to theorycraft with him. I'm not sure if it's going to be enough to make him a staple of dungeon teams, but I do think that it's going to make him a staple, or a lot closer to being a staple, of a lot of TOA teams, Hall of Heroes teams, Secret Dungeon teams, things like that. Now, next up, we've got Geldnir, the Light Emperor. Again, this is another, my only LD5 is Beelzebub, so it's hard for me to kind of compare some of these monsters. I've always thought I would actually enjoy having Geldnir. I know a lot of people complain he's weak. He fits my playstyle. So I like the buff direction that they went with him. Obviously, they're giving him more healing. I think for an LD5, the buff is maybe a little smaller than it should have been. Like, it's basically, he's going to be recovering the attack target's HP by 20% of the target's max HP. I feel like maybe that's a little small. I think I'd rather see something like 25 or 30%. And then it says, if you have 5 knowledge, recovers the attack target's HP by 50% of the attack target's max HP. I'd like to see that be death prevention, like Triana. So kind of where you do maybe 25% healing, which is just equal to a Molly passive, and then death prevention when you have 5 knowledge, which is like Triana. That to me would probably be the ideal for him. But again, this is a step in the right direction. Most of the time, it seems like when they buff a monster and the buff isn't enough, they do come back to that monster and keep working him forward. And that's not a bad way to do it, because, if you overbuff a monster, you can break the game too. So, okay, so next up, they gave a buff to Cadiz. They boosted his chance to remove beneficial effects, and they increased the amount of attack bar that he absorbs. Again, not owning Cadiz, sometimes you're on the outside looking in. I don't feel like this was particularly necessary. I think Cadiz was already really strong. I feel like he's one of the LD5s. He'd be in like my top 20 most wanted. And this probably wasn't strictly speaking necessary, but I don't think it's game breaking either. It's just a tweak. So next up, we've got Craka, who I think is one of the 2 lottery winners in this balance patch. Craka went from like she was like borderline F tier. I mean, probably not that bad. Again, it's an outside looking in thing, but so her skill right now is basically she resurrects one ally, gives them invincibility, and resets their skills so that they're all usable. And it's being changed to an AoE skill reset. Now, that does come at a cost. You're going to see and it's a very long cooldown. It's a 7-turn cooldown, which they're reducing it to 6 turns. But they're adding a qualifier that for every ally you resurrect, the cooldown increases by 1 turn. So actually it stays at 7 because you have to reduce at least 1 ally. But then it can go out to 8 or 9 if you're reviving 2 or 3 allies. So her role there is as a reviver, but her skill 2 is still the same normal Hell Lady skill 2 that's going to do defense break and turn cycling. And it's very powerful. So even though she can't really resurrect again unless the fight goes another 8-9 turns, she is still going to be really effective within the fight. I think she instantly becomes S tier after this buff. Now, speaking of S tier Hell Ladies, Ethna was already probably around S tier, somewhere between S and SS tier, and she got buffed. This is maybe the only monster in this patch that I think absolutely did not need it. There were a couple of others that were like on the borderline. Ethna was already super strong. My thought on this, though, is it feels like this is a buff to counter the Vigor meta, honestly. Currently, she strips. Her capture skill, I think it hits 6 or 7 times, and it strips 1 beneficial effect per hit and then stuns at the end of that. Now it steals a beneficial effect instead of stripping it. So since Ethna is pretty often used to counter Vigor already, this makes her a more effective Vigor counter. I mean, obviously she works monsters like Shihu as well, so she's going to counter any kind of water monster that self-buffs. And actually, as I'm saying it on video right now, she's even more effective against Shihu because she's going to steal that invincibility and immunity from him. That's really, really strong. So Ethna, definitely, to me, she probably just became a double S tier monster. The other big thing about this is I'm thinking you could actually run Ethna with a speed gap in a violent team. So normally if you're violent, you want, and I'm talking to RTA now, normally if you're violent, you want all your violent monsters to be on violent, or you want all your monsters to be on violent and about the same speed, specifically because you don't want to get cut, right? But in this case, it no longer matters so much if you get cut because Ethna is going to be stealing immunity right back and still protecting herself. So you could have a big speed gap, which would allow you to run like a swift Ethna or just an ultra fast despair Ethna or whatever you wanted to do. And then you stay immune so that you're okay if the rest of your team is slower, but you get to outspeed and incapacitate an enemy with that skill 3 stun right off the bat. So she's going to be really strong. She's going to be really interesting. And I do actually have an Ethna. She's not skilled up. She will be soon. She just moved to the top of my list. So yeah, I'm looking forward to playing around with her. Now next up is Helena, the Fire Unicorn. So right now she absorbs the attack bar by 10% each, but the interesting thing here is it's for 2 turns, and I've got to be honest, you don't see Helena all that often, so I don't remember exactly how the mechanic works, if it displays a debuff on screen or what the case may be, but right now basically imagine you're facing a team with 4 enemies. That means you're absorbing 80% attack bar over 2 turns. Now you'd be absorbing 100, so that's a big boost on the surface. But right now, like in Guild War, you could be facing a team with 3 enemies. If you've already killed one, there's 2 left. And so then it becomes much bigger because where you'd only be absorbing, let's say, 40% attack bar over 2 turns, now you're still absorbing 100%, and it's a bigger drain from the enemies. So I think she definitely got a boost. I don't know if it's going to make her RTA consistent, but she'll definitely make some appearances in RTA. But she is going to be super, super strong on Guild War offense. Now, not so much on and on Siege offense as well. On Guild content offense, I think this is actually a really big buff. She's going to turn cycle, not as much as Diana, but she's going to turn cycle quite a bit more now. And when you throw in the fact that she's got the damage reduction from water monsters on her passive, she basically becomes like she gets a passive that's almost as good as Amelia's. Different, but almost as good. And then she gets turn cycling that's almost as good as Diana's. Different, but almost as good. So now she's got like facets of each of the 2 strongest unicorns. Overall, I think she's going to be a really intriguing monster. This is probably, to me, like the 3rd biggest buff in this patch. I don't know. There's a lot of really interesting buffs, but in a lot of ways, I think this one's sneaky because it's like one small line. I don't know if anybody's really talking about it much, but and part of that is because for RTA, it's not quite as big. It's still a big buff, but it's not quite as big for RTA as it is for guild content. Okay, next up, we've got the Water Art Master. Now, right now, he's got a passive that says when enemies remove harmful effects. So basically, if an enemy cleanses, the attack bar of all allies will be increased by 25%. And to that, to his passive, they're also adding whenever the enemy basically, the wording here is very difficult, but what they're saying, the way I read it anyway, is that whenever the enemy strips you, you're also gonna boost by 25%. Obviously, like let's say you get stripped by a Chiwu, then there's attack bar pushback, and you're probably not going to be cut. Or you get stripped by a Triton, same thing, attack bar pushback, you're not going to be cut. But this is meta changing for monsters like Lauren or anybody that does single target strip with the intention of controlling your team. So for me, going to RTA, I think of like the Ganny Hathor teams that operate with 3 single target strippers. This now gives you the ability to maybe boost in front of that Ganny or that Hathor and rebuff yourself, which is absolutely huge. The nicest thing is that it works on a passive, so you can't just disable this guy the way you would a Ganymede, for example. If you steal Ganny, then they just disable the Ganny and you can't reset Hathor. In this case, this is going to give you a chance to cut. Now, is it going to make him constantly meta? I don't know. I think he might have still needed a little bit more to be consistently in the meta, but not every monster has to be consistently in the meta. I think sometimes when you have a monster that serves a unique but powerful counter role, that's really, really good in my eyes. And that's what this is. He's basically the only monster in the game that does this. So it makes a very unique role. And it doesn't just have to be countering Hathors. It's basically a counter to any kind of control team that seeks to strip you down by single target means. He's also going to be pretty devastating against monsters that have skill 1 single target strip. So for example, this is a really strong counter against like a Velajul. Now the Wind Art Master is the one I think hit the biggest jackpot in this buff. He actually got 2 buffs. You only see one on screen right now because the other one is an awakening effect, but basically what's happened with him is his skill 2, they've added a defense break, so it's an AoE strip glancing and defense break, which is really, really strong. And then his skill 3, currently, the way it works is that he attacks all enemies to decrease attack bar by 50% each. And then if the enemy's attack bar is already at 0, he increases cooldown by 1 turn. Now the problem with that is it's like a dozen accuracy checks. Like literally if you're using him on arena offense, for example, you have to land 12 accuracy checks to increase the entire enemy team by 1 turn of cooldown. It's just... It sounds great in theory, but it was just a little underwhelming. So they've boosted that to you reduce the enemy attack bar by 75%, which now means that if you're outspeeding, so think of it as like, for example, if you run a Savannah comp, now you could potentially increase the enemy cooldown by 2 turns, which is a lot more significant because they can't just proc right back into their skills. And it's much easier to get to that point where you increase their cooldown by at least 1 turn. So it's a huge, huge buff. It takes a monster that I thought he was kind of sneaky good, but very RNG based before. I thought he was maybe like a B or A tier monster. And it gives him the potential to actually move up into S tier, depending on what comps we work out with him. So I think he's probably the jackpot winner of this overall patch. Now, the other one that a lot of people are going to be talking about is the Fire Demon. And this buff that he's got, this is really interesting. So they've actually added a new effect to the game, which is Harmful Effect Removal Block. Now, the way I'm reading this is that the Harmful Effect Removal Block, which does what it sounds like, it stops you from removing harmful effects, can be cleansed. And if it can be cleansed, then that means if you cleanse your team twice, you'll still get rid of your harmful effects. And if that's the case, then I do think that the demon is very counterable still. And I'm not positive that he does all that much more than he does now. I mean, he definitely does more. It's a nice buff no matter what. But the question is, how much of a buff is it? So if this thing can't be cleansed at all, then it might be a really big buff. And if it can be cleansed, then it's still a nice buff, but it didn't like necessarily catapult him into, you know, like She Who Post buff status or anything like that. Okay, then we have a series of buffs for the pirate captains. The wind and, well, we'll start off with the light one, Brig, who I actually had used quite a bit in Steel Fortress, and he is, I want to say he's underrated, but he's not. The thing is, he doesn't like really fit in with anything because you have to build a comp around him. He hits really hard. He does lots of debuffs. Brig is the light pirate captain, so I jumped down a little. He's actually a fun monster to play around with, has a cool animation also, but he just didn't quite do enough because you have to build a comp around him. He's kind of like the assassins. Like, he just doesn't fit in the current meta anymore. So they gave him a damage boost, but I feel like that's probably not the buff that he needed. He needed a buff to set himself up. What he really needed was for his skill 3 probably to strip, or maybe just his skill 2 to strip to set up the skill 3, so at least it's not broken. But I mean, the damage boost is nice, but I honestly don't think this is going to bring him back into the meta because he already hit pretty hard. That wasn't his issue. Now, the Wind Pirate Captain, they've given him the ability to turn cycle a little bit. Again, it's a nice buff. Anytime they give your monsters more, it's nice, but I don't see this bringing him into the meta either. Now, the most interesting one of these three is the Fire Pirate Captain. That's why I went from bottom to top. He has effectively been given the Detonate skill. It's not exactly. It's kind of like a budget detonate. So basically, he can detonate the bomb on one enemy monster, and then it reduces the bombs. If you've done an AoE bomb, obviously, if there's bombs on other monsters, it reduces the bomb timer by 1 turn on all other enemy monsters. So it becomes like an AoE detonate, like budget Jaara, basically. But the thing is, when we say budget monster, we're saying that a monster that does something but not quite as well. This one is a little bit different, though, because bombers are actually making a comeback, at least in high-level Guild Siege, because they're really good counters against the most common defenses now, like KVS. So the ability to detonate bombs might actually play really significantly into Siege. I think that while this guy's not going to be overpowered and he's not going to be your first go-to monster, I think we may start to see... And this is how bad he is. I don't even know his name. But that Fire Pirate Captain, Brig. No, Brig is the light one. Craka. There we go. No, Craka's the... Carrack. There we go. Carrack, I think we might see Carrack like consistently used in siege offense. That'll be the only place, but that's enough. Again, if a monster has a place in the game where you want to use them, to me, then that's valuable. So I think this buff is really useful for him. So all 5 Death Knights got some sort of buff. Basically, one of the things that we knew was coming when Artifacts came out was that the next balance patch would have a lot of guaranteed crushing hits. So the Death Knights all get a guaranteed crushing hit, and this is actually kind of nice because it means you don't really need to build them in crit rate, which we don't already anyway, because they're mostly all supports. And so monsters that weren't critting at all, because we're not giving them crit rate, now that's basically like getting a free 30% damage boost. It also gives you a place to put all those crushing hit artifacts, so it is kind of like a nice little damage buff across the board. That's going to be on their Deadly Blow skill. Now, for the Fire, Wind, and Light ones, they also got 25% damage increases across the board. This doesn't really make any difference whatsoever, I think for the Wind one. It just really doesn't because of the role that we use him in. But it's going to make a little difference for the Fire one, and it's going to make more of a difference for the Light one. The Water and Dark ones got a decrease on their skill 2 cooldown, which is actually pretty significant because that's a defense break. Honestly, I think this is enough to bring Diaz, maybe not back into like meta, but it definitely made Diaz consistently usable in Guild War content, which is pretty nice because he's an LD4. And he was already still not bad. Like, I still use him once in a while. He's a nice counter to certain light monsters. He's a, huge dark tank. And now he's gotten a damage boost, he's gotten a guaranteed crushing hit, and he's getting a 2-turn defense break. I think he becomes very usable in 4-star siege bases. Now, Fedora also gets a cooldown decrease on his decline. It goes from 5 turns to 4 when it's fully skilled up, which is nice. So Fedora right now, he protects all that. It's an AoE Endure, and then it's also an AoE Cleanse and Immunity. 2-turn immunity, 1-turn Endure. I don't really think it's enough for him to be honest. Now, he does... He was used for a little while to counter one specific G3 siege defense. I can't remember quite which one, but it's more of a luxury thing. I just don't see this being all that significant for Fedora. Same thing for Briand. I don't think the buffs were enough to make the Wind one something that we're going to use consistently. However, the fire one Arnold is already used as a counter for Molongs, and so the buffs to him are actually pretty nice, because if it's a monster you're already using, even if it's just a specific counter, getting those buffs are going to make him just that much better when you use him. So the big question now is going to be Conrad, the light one. Conrad got one of the most interesting buffs because it's hard to tell if this is going to be like crazy OP or completely worthless. So as a reminder, he's getting the guaranteed crushing hit on his skill 1, but then the big one for him is his skill 3, the trade skill, which is currently he attacks an enemy, reviving an ally monster with 30% HP if the enemy is eliminated by this attack. And then if there is no revivable ally on the field, all allies receive a damage absorbing shield for 2 turns. The amount of absorption differs according to the monster's level. So basically it's a 4800 HP shield for a level 40 monster. This is going to change to the HP ratio with the enemy target, boss excluded. Changes the HP ratio with the enemy target, and then creates a shield which is proportionate to your level on all allies for 2 turns to absorb damage. Now at the top it also says increased the shield amount by 50%. So I'm thinking this might be a 7200 HP shield, which is actually a really thick shield. And then on top of that, the ability to trade HP ratios with the allies. Now this is again something you could really only manipulate on guild content offense, but you bring him in against the dark tank like a Xzandro, and then as long as he doesn't die, he's going to be trading his HP ratio with the Xzandro. Now the really nice thing about this is that it makes his kit fit together much more. He basically becomes a support monster, even though he's an attack type. He is, I would view him as basically a support monster. And that works actually much better for the role that he's serving. So the reason I view him as a support monster is because obviously if he just gets one shot, then he doesn't get a chance to use his trade. So he's got to be able to take a lot of damage and then switch those HP ratios and shield everybody up. It's going to be interesting. I don't know that he can, I don't know that you can necessarily bring him into an Orion Xzandro, for example, and expect him to survive long enough to use his skill 3 and not get stunned. Okay, now the next 3 families that got buffed, the Kobold Bombers, the Phantom Thieves, and the Epikion Priests. So for the Kobold Bombers, this one we're just going to jump past pretty quick because it's the exact same buff for all 3 of them. Basically, they were given a guaranteed crushing hit, which is, to me, this effectively just makes them even more Miho counters. So right now, the best way to counter Miho is typically bombs or HP splash damage, but if you don't have a Molong and you don't have a the Dark Sea Emperor King, then bombs are usually the way to go. So Kobold Bombers now with the guaranteed crushing hit just became even better Miho counters. Now for the Phantom Thieves, the light one, his Illusion of Magic right here, this basically, it balances out HP ratio with you and a target ally and then gives you a 2-turn invincibility. And it's a 6-turn cooldown right now, but that decreases to 3 if both you and the ally are below 50% health. So this skill right here, it sounds great in concept, but it's not very practical for most comps. What they've done is they decreased the cool time 1 turn further, and they granted HP recovery. I don't think this is going to make him usable in PvP. I think it's a nice support skill for PvE, but there's better options. Now, both the water and the light one on their skill 2, it's now a guaranteed crushing hit. Again, this kind of ties back into artifacts, so they had to do a lot of guaranteed crushing hits. And they increased the damage by 167%, which is actually a really good fit for the water one. And then Lure did get a second buff also, and this is a much bigger buff for him, which is... So his Crime Alert skill, 4-turn cooldown AoE that also decreases attack bar and defense breaks for 2 turns. This was already a guaranteed crushing hit, so the nice thing here is that those artifacts that give crushing hit damage boost, they're going to synergize because he now has 2 guaranteed crushing hits. And the AoE attack bar reduction and defense break, he was actually a decent monster already. He fell out of the meta because there's other AoE defense breakers that do more. But when you put the you put that huge damage increase, I mean it's a 190% damage increase, and when you combine that with the 167% he's getting on his skill 2, and then you combine that with artifacts, he's actually going to be a really hard-hitting monster that can also do an AoE absorb and defense break. Now, he doesn't set himself up. And for me, that's a really important thing. To be a monster you win because of, they need to set themselves up, or they need to just be so strong that they don't need setup. Lure is still going to need some sort of setup. He still has to be in there with a stripper or a monster to protect him. So he's going to be like a monster you win with, but I do see comps now that work much more effectively with him. And I could also see him potentially being on some interesting speed defense comps. Like in a 4-star tower base, because he's got a really, 105 base speed. Gemini followed by Lure, because now you've got your speed lead and your AoE strip and 2 defense breakers. So Gemini defense breaks, then Lure just does tons of damage, and anything that Gemini didn't defense break, Lure gives you your backup defense break. And then you do some sort of AoE damage or control from there. So I do see actually Lure maybe being usable in like some Guardian, anywhere from low all the way up to probably high Guardian 1 Guild Siege defenses. And he could be kind of fun to play around with on offense as well. Now, the Epikion Priests, all of them got a little boost to the amount of self-healing they do off their skill 1. Now, their skill 1, since it scales off of HP and you build them all in triple HP, it actually already did hit pretty hard. So this is a nice little boost that'll be noticeable, particularly since Rena actually still is used as like a Ciara counter. And then Chloe is also used on a fairly regular basis, like in Chloe Kali Covenant comps. Now, the heal that the water, fire, and the light one all have has also been boosted, where right now it heals one ally 25% and one ally 15%. It's being changed to heal one ally 25% and then everyone by 15%. So that's also a nice little boost to them. The wind and the dark one, now they have probably, so Chloe's invincibility, that's the best skill that any Epikion Priest has, obviously, but the second best skill is the block flow, which the wind and the dark one, so the wind one's Michelle, the dark one is Rahid, something like that. So the second best skill of the Epikion Priest is this block flow. Now this, I think, this is one of the buffs that is not going to get a lot of attention on this patch, but I actually think this is one that should get some attention for PvE purposes. And the reason I think this won't get a lot of attention is because a lot of people may not have ever paid any attention to what this skill does. Block flow extends the time of beneficial effects and shortens the time of harmful effects granted on all allies, and recovers their HP by 10% each. Recovery amount increases by 5% per harmful or beneficial effect granted on the allies. This is done in a 3-turn cooldown, and the recovery does boost up to 13%. So Michelle is already actually really, really good for certain PvE content, such as the Tartarus boss in Labyrinth. And the Dark One's getting the boost also, and she's getting another buff. We'll talk about that in a moment. But for Michelle, this is going to be super relevant for PvE meta, particularly for early and early mid-game players who don't have access to tons of crazy Nat 5s, or for some PvE metas where the total number of stars of the monsters you use are limited, like Lumel, or like in Karzan, where you can only use 4-star monsters and below, and you get a lot of debuffs. So picture like a Karzan team where you're running 4 buffs, and then the boss is putting 2 more debuffs on you. That's 6, or maybe you're running 3 buffs, right? So you got 3 buffs and 2 debuffs, that's 5 total buffs, positive and negative. So she's going to heal the entire team 60%. And then she's basically going to cleanse all those debuffs off and extend the duration of all those buffs. This makes her extremely viable in PvE, not just for early and mid-game players. She's really going to be viable for everybody. Now, the Dark One, her skill 3 right now recovers 100% of your HP if the enemy dies, which is totally pointless because she can't kill anything unless you build her in like G3 attack build, and then she just dies in one hit because she's an LD3, so she has no base stats. So they're changing it to attacks the enemy target 3 times to inflict damage. The attack will deal more damage according to your max HP. Also, if the enemy dies, creates a shield by the target's max HP on all allies for 2 turns. The amount of the shield cannot exceed twice your max HP. I don't really think this is going to propel her into the meta throughout the entire game, but I do think it makes her a usable monster because she's a bruiser type that scales to HP, so you can build her super tanky and use her as a counter to light nukers, but you can also use her as like a manipulation. If somebody builds a poor defense, it's like, let's say they only have 1 primary damage dealer on the defense. So you could take in 2 monsters of the opposite attribute to make sure the damage dealer always hits just your Rahid or Rashid, whichever the name of the Dark One is. And then it's your tank, but it's also a damage dealing, it's a bruiser tank. So I do think it's going to be a usable monster. I don't think it's one that people are going to rush out and build, but I think it does become usable. So at the end of this balance patch, we just have a few modifications. Conrad's shield, which we talked about already, the shield amount now increases through skill ups, and that's where he gets the extra 50%. The Dark Phoenix Jaara now gets a little bit of turn cycling. So the Awakening skill changes from 25% accuracy to some turn cycling on the Dark Nova. This is actually a nice little boost. Gains a turn instantly if the enemy dies. It's kind of similar to like the Rauk passive, except that it only works off, I'm pretty sure the Dark Nova is skill 2. And then the Wind Art Master I talked about earlier, so instead of awakening into critical rate, this is where we get the decreased defense on the skill 2. And then I don't think we need to go through just like the bug cleanup on the skill area modification. So guys, that is it for our review of the balance patch. All in all, I wasn't expecting this patch to drop. I am pretty excited about it. If you guys saw, because I saw the last balance patch on stream and I didn't react all that well to it, I'm actually still kind of salty about it, I'm not going to lie. The Beast Rider nerfs, I thought the nerfs were too big, and they didn't nerf Hathor, which I was really upset about after last RTA season. But this balance patch I'm really enthused about. Actually, the last one's the only one I ever really didn't like. I'm really enthused about this one. I mean, obviously, there's always stuff that we would have liked to seen. I still think Hathor needs to be nerfed. I think they need to remove the strip from her skill 2. It's just broken. There's some other monsters I'd like to see boosted up and so forth, but they've introduced a couple of new mechanics into the game. They've taken some monsters that have been like basically completely out of the meta for years, and they've made them usable again. They didn't boost, like last time they buffed Shihu, who was already a double S monster. It was just unnecessary. So this one, to me, is a genuine balance patch. They took a lot of monsters that really needed it. They made them stronger. The only monster that was maybe even a little questionable was Ethna, but I think I see why they did it. Again, it's a vigor counter, taking a monster that's already in the meta so that you don't have to force it in there. So overall, I'm really excited about this balance patch. I can't wait to see how it comes out. Hopefully it doesn't have any big impacts on SWC, but I do expect that we'll see maybe like Craka. We'll certainly see Ethna. So it might have some impacts on SWC, and hopefully it's not too game-changing. But on that note, guys, as always, I hope you enjoyed the video. I appreciate you watching, and we'll see you next time. Hey guys, if you're still with me to this point, then that means that you probably liked the video, found it entertaining, or even better, both. So please smash the like button, hit the subscribe button, and leave a comment down below, because those things help the channel grow, and more importantly, they show me that the video is useful, and that's the whole reason I do this in the first place.